The groom's uncle touched my arm so gently I almost didn't notice. He was maybe 60, thick-necked and weathered in the way that outdoor men get, and he leaned down beside my chair at that corner table I'd picked specifically to stay invisible. "Excuse me," he said quietly, glancing at my face like he was trying to play something. "Are you Stella Hartwell, the superintendent? From the Kaibab crew?" I told him I was. He straightened slowly. Then he turned toward the main reception tent, where 24 firefighters from my brother-in-law's station were sitting together at a long table near the dance floor. Men and women still in the clean dress clothes that somehow never quite fit people who spend their lives covered in soot and gear. He raised his voice just enough to carry. "Hey, this is Superintendent Hartwell. She's the one who got Brody's crew off the rim road." The silence happened the way a power outage does. Everything running at full noise, and then nothing. I watched Chief Callahan set down his beer glass. He was maybe 15 feet away, a big man in his late 50s who'd spent 30 years running fire operations across northern Arizona, and he stood the way people stand when something demands it. Around him, chairs pushed back. Not all at once, but close. Firefighter after firefighter, some in their 30s, some with gray in their hair, a few I recognized and more I didn't. They rose until there were close to 40 of them standing in that tent, facing me in a Sedona canyon, at a wedding I had almost talked myself out of attending. My sister Lacey stood frozen at the edge of the dance floor in her lace gown, champagne flute in one hand, the other pressed flat against her chest. And my father, who had sent me a text message 36 hours earlier, telling me that nobody wanted to hear about wildfires on my sister's special day, and that I should please leave the gear and the war stories at home, stood very still between the tent poles with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger. Not the familiar distant disappointment, something closer to confusion. The kind that happens when the story you've been telling yourself for years turns out to have different characters in it than you thought. My name is Stella Hartwell. I'm 30 years old. I'm a wildland fire superintendent with the Southwest Interagency Hotshot program, and this is the story of the night two entirely separate versions of my life ended up in the same canyon. I grew up in Cottonwood, Arizona, a small town in the Verde Valley about 90 minutes south of Flagstaff, in a house that always smelled like my mother's chicken tortilla soup and library books. My mother was a librarian at the town branch for most of my childhood. My father spent 27 years as the principal of Cottonwood High School. They were good people in the way that community pillars are good, steady, known, invested in the fabric of a place. The kind of people everyone greets by name at the grocery store. My younger sister Lacey was what my parents understood. She was warm and pretty and interested in things they could talk about at dinner, without anyone getting uncomfortable. She studied early childhood education at NAU. She fell in love with a firefighter named Garrett from the Flagstaff FD. The kind of relationship my parents called a blessing out loud. I was the other kind of daughter. I was 11 years old the first time I saw hotshot crews working a fire on the ridge behind our neighborhood. I remember standing in the backyard with the sky, an orange-brown color that made everything feel like a dream, watching those figures in yellow shirts and hard hats move along the ridgeline with their hand tools. Methodical and certain in the middle of all that chaos, something locked into place for me that I didn't have language for yet. By high school, I'd read everything I could find about wildland fire. The history, the science, the culture. My father looked at the books on my shelf the way other parents might look at a speeding ticket, like evidence of something that needed correcting. He'd said it plainly, not then. He'd just redirect. "Have you thought about nursing? Your aunt teaches second grade over in Camp Verde. You'd be great with kids." He wasn't cruel about it. He just genuinely could not understand why I would choose something so dangerous when so many safer paths were available. I applied to the National Park Service's fire training program the summer I graduated high school. My mother cried. Not the proud kind. Wildland firefighting is not what most people picture. It's not the red engine and the ladder truck. It's 20-person crews hiking into remote terrain with chainsaws and hand tools to cut fire lines in 100-degree heat, sleeping in the dirt, spending weeks away from anything resembling normal life. Hotshot crews are the elite tier, the ones who go into the hardest terrain when conditions are worst. Getting certified as a hotshot crew member takes years. Getting your superintendent certification takes a decade or more of performance under pressure. I loved every miserable, exhausting, terrifying, beautiful minute of it. But my family processed my career the way you process a relative who joined a cult, politely alarmed, hoping it would pass. Over the years, my father stopped asking questions about my work and started making comments. "Still doing the fire thing?" When I got my hotshot certification, he told my mother at Thanksgiving that he hoped I had a backup plan. When I was promoted to superintendent at 28, one of the younger supers in the Southwest, He asked if that meant I'd finally be working at a desk. I wasn't angry. I'd stopped expecting anything different. Disappointment has a shelf life. After a while, it just becomes the temperature of the room. 3 days before Lacey's wedding, I was sitting in my truck outside the crew cache in Williams, going through the previous week's incident reports, when my phone buzzed. The text was from my father. Stella, your sister's wedding is the most important day of her life. Please don't make it about your job. Nobody wants wildfire talk at a wedding. I read it twice. Then I sat there with the phone in my lap, while the afternoon wind pushed dust across the parking lot, and 2 of my crew members walked past the windows without noticing me. It was such a specific kind of dismissal. Not even hostile, exactly. Just certain. The way he'd always been certain that my career was a phase, an inconvenience, something to be managed so it didn't disrupt the actual story he wanted to tell about his family. Even on the eve of a wedding, where the groom was a career firefighter. Even with 40 members of the Flagstaff FD on the guest list. My father still couldn't locate one sentence of acknowledgement for what I did. That evening I sat in my apartment in Flagstaff and thought seriously about calling in a fake conflict with a training exercise. I'm good at that. I've been constructing plausible professional emergencies to avoid family events since I was 23. My phone rang around 8. It was Devlin. Devlin had been my crew captain for 4 years before he retired last spring. He's 52, built like a man who spent 3 decades carrying a 40-pound pack up steep terrain, and he has the specific kind of calm that comes from having made life and death calls in real time for most of his adult life. He's not warm exactly. He's steady, which is better. You're talking yourself out of going, he said when I picked up. I'm evaluating my options. Stella. A pause. You spent 2 years being investigated and second-guessed and questioned by people who were never anywhere near that ridge. You went to every single hearing. You filed every report. You didn't hide. This is different. It's not, though. His voice was level. Your crew goes to the canyon knowing it's going to be hard. They don't ask permission first. I didn't say anything for a while. Go to the wedding, he said. Be who you are. Let the rest sort itself out. I hung up and opened my closet and pulled out the nicest civilian clothes I owned. Dark slacks, a simple green blouse, which looked exactly like the clothes of someone who only owns work gear, and bought these once for a work conference 2 years ago. I ironed them badly and went to bed. The drive down into Sedona the next afternoon was the kind of beautiful that reminds you why you chose a life in landscapes. Red rock formations catching the late light, juniper and pinyon pine threading the hillsides, that deep layered blue sky that only exists in the high desert, at the edge of evening. I had the windows down and something old on the radio, and I told myself I was fine. The venue was a private ranch property in Boynton Canyon, open-air pavilion, string lights in the oaks, that soft rose-gold canyon glow that makes everything look like it's been filtered through something warmer than reality. Half the guests were already there when I arrived. I recognized FD people from Lacey's save-the-date photos. A few of my mother's book club friends. My father's former vice principal, the usual architecture of a family event. My mother found me near the entrance in her pale blue dress and the gold earrings she saves for occasions. She hugged me with that specific careful warmth that meant she was relieved. I came and slightly worried about what came next. You look nice, she said, which from her meant she'd been expecting me in a yellow Nomex shirt. She glanced around, lowering her voice. Your father's already inside. Just, maybe don't bring up the kebab thing tonight, okay? He gets worked up. The kebab thing. That's what she called the incident that generated 4 months of federal investigation, a safety board review, and ultimately a commendation for decision-making under extreme pressure. The kebab thing. I nodded, because I've been nodding at versions of this request my entire adult life. My father spotted me from across the pavilion. He's 61 now, still upright and deliberate the way former school principals tend to be, like they never quite stop being in charge of a hallway. He crossed the space between us without hurrying, looked me over once, and offered a handshake that became a brief, stiff hug. Glad you made it, he said. Wouldn't miss it. Good, he nodded once. Lacey's happy, let's keep the focus there. Not a question, not an opening, just a directive. The ceremony was beautiful. Lacey cried. Garrett cried. The officiant made a joke about firefighters always knowing how to handle heat, and everyone laughed. I laughed too. My seat card was at a table near the back, which I appreciated for different reasons than ever assigned it, probably intended. The reception started and the dancing started, and I stayed at my table and watched the Flagstaff FD crew take over the dance floor, with the kind of unself-conscious energy that people get when they spend enough time relying on each other for their lives. My sister found me about an hour in. She was still in her gown, holding 2 glasses of champagne. looking genuinely happy in a way that made everything else feel small. She sat down beside me, and for a few minutes we talked the way we used to when we were kids sharing a room. Easy, and sideways, and about nothing in particular. Then she set her glass down and looked at me directly. "Dad told me about the text he sent," she said. I didn't respond. "I want you to know I didn't ask him to do that," she paused. "But I also didn't tell him not to." She looked down at her hands. "And that's on me. I'm sorry." That landed heavier than I expected. Not because it fixed anything, but because she meant it, and real apologies from the people who raised you alongside your problems are rarer than they should be. She left to find her husband a few minutes later, and I sat with that apology in the quiet, turning it over. The groom's uncle found me about 40 minutes later. He came over with the slightly uncertain walk of someone who thinks they've recognized someone, but isn't sure they have the nerve to say so. He was wearing a bolo tie and a sport coat, and his hands were the hands of someone who'd spent years in physical work. "I apologize for interrupting," he said. "Are you Stella Hartwell, from the Coconino Hotshots?" "Southwest program now," I said, "but yes." He nodded slowly. "My nephew was on the Rim Road that day. Brody, he's one of Garrett's guys." I knew the name. Brody had been on a contract crew working in adjacent sector during the Kaibab fire. Not under my direct command, but close enough that my withdrawal order had affected his crew's position. I hadn't known he was connected to this family. "He talks about you," the uncle said quietly. "He said you made the call before anyone else was willing to make it. That you just knew." I don't have a clean way to explain what that call actually was. The wind shifted and the canyon geometry was wrong, and something in my gut that I've spent 12 years calibrating told me we had about 8 minutes before the situation became unsurvivable. That's not heroism, that's accumulated pattern recognition under extreme pressure, built over a decade of watching fire move through terrain. I made the call. We moved. 20 minutes later, the fire ran through the exact ground we'd been standing on. "I'm glad everyone got out," I said. He nodded once. Then he turned toward the main tables. "Hey," his voice carried, "I want you all to know. This is Stella Hartwell. She's the superintendent who called the withdrawal on the Rim Road." Chief Callahan set down his glass. I don't have adequate words for what it feels like to watch that kind of recognition move through a room of people who understand what the Rim Road fire actually was. It's not like applause. It's more serious than that. Chief Callahan stood first, and then one of his senior captains, and then it moved down the long table like something with its own momentum. Garrett stood. A woman I didn't recognize in a navy dress pressed her hand over her heart. One of the older men crossed himself quietly. By the time the motion stopped, there were close to 40 firefighters and fire community people on their feet in that canyon. The band stumbled between songs and never quite found the next one. I stood slowly from my chair, because I didn't know what else to do. Into that quiet, Chief Callahan's voice came clear and weighted across the pavilion. "What she did on that ridge," he said, "saved 14 lives, including my nephew's crew chief." He looked at me directly. "We don't forget that." My mother's hand came up over her mouth. My father stood perfectly still between 2 oak trees strung with white lights, and his face was the face of a man, watching something he has no existing category for. What followed is something I'll spend a long time trying to find the right words for. A retired captain from the Prescott region crossed the pavilion to shake my hand and told me he'd used the Kaibab incident as a case study in his advanced fire behavior course at the State Training Academy. A woman mentioned that her husband had been grounded that season with a knee injury and would have been in Brody's adjacent sector if my withdrawal order hadn't rippled outward the way it did. A young firefighter, maybe 24, told me he'd chosen hotshot training specifically because of what he'd read about the Rim Road decision. "My instructor said the hardest call in fire is pulling back when everyone's waiting for you to push forward," he said quietly. "He said you made it look easy." A pause. I know it wasn't. I couldn't speak for a moment. Standing there in the warm Sedona evening, surrounded by that kind of earned and specific respect, the thing I felt most wasn't satisfaction. It was closer to grief, the quiet ache of understanding what it would have meant to have even a fraction of this from one particular person who was standing 40 feet away. Around 9, I slipped out toward the back edge of the property, where a low stone wall separated the wedding lights from the canyon dark. The sky above the red rock walls was enormous and star-filled, and unhurried in the way desert skies get once the light fully dies. Devlin appeared, about 10 minutes later, because of course he did. "How'd you know where I'd be?" I asked. "You always find the wall," he said. He was holding 2 bottles of beer, and he gave me one without asking. We stood there in the dark for a while without needing to fill it. Finally he said, "You okay?" That question from him, at that hour. "I'm 30 years old," I said. And I still wanted my dad to look proud of me tonight. Yeah, he said. Not dismissive, not sorry. Just honest acknowledgement. That one doesn't go away clean. He told me about his own father then. A man who'd spent his whole working life in the copper mines over in Globe, and never once saw the sense in his son's career choice. He died thinking I'd wasted my talent, Devlin said. I think about that. But I also think about the 23 people alive right now who might not be if I'd gone to work at his buddy's hardware store instead. He took a slow drink. You do the work that's yours to do, whether someone's watching or not. Footsteps on the gravel behind us. I turned expecting a guest heading for the parking lot. It was Lacey, still in her gown, veil gone, looking smaller and more like the kid I grew up with than she had all evening. Devlin finished his beer and quietly excused himself. My sister leaned against the wall beside me and looked out at the canyon dark. Neither of us talked for a while. I owe you more than what I said earlier, she finally said. Lacey. No, let me. She exhaled slowly. I spent a lot of years being the easy daughter, the one they understood. I liked that. I didn't question it. She shook her head. But tonight, watching those people stand up, those are firefighters, Stella. Hard people who've seen hard things, and they just stood like it was the only possible thing to do. Her voice went tight. I've always been terrified something would happen to you on a fire, and I think some of that turned into not asking about your work, not engaging with it, because if I didn't know the details it felt safer. Like not looking at the forecast. She paused. That wasn't fair to you. I looked at my little sister in her wedding dress in the desert dark, and felt the specific sadness of wasted time, not anger, just the quiet arithmetic of years. I'm proud of you, she said. I always have been. I just didn't know how to be proud of something I was afraid of losing. My mother came out a few minutes after Lacey went back inside. She wasn't crying, but she was close. I could tell by the way she was holding her shoulders. She told me she'd been following the Southwest Hotshot Program's public incident reports online since the Kaibab fire. That she'd read every word of the safety board findings. That she had the Arizona Republic article bookmarked on her phone. The one with the quote from the regional forester calling my withdrawal the most decisive call of that entire fire season. You never said anything, I said. I didn't know how to bring it up without your father getting upset. She looked down at her hands. And I didn't know how to be proud of you in front of him, without making him feel like he was being accused of something. That sentence did something to me. Not anger. More like a door opening onto a room I hadn't known was there. My father came last. He walked out to the stone wall alone, without my mother, which told me he'd made a deliberate decision about something. He stood beside me and said nothing for a long time, looking out at the canyon walls in the starlight. Then he said, I need to tell you something I haven't told anyone, except your mother. I waited. He told me about a summer when he was 8 years old. His family had lived on a rural stretch outside of Payson, ranch country, scrub oak and ponderosa pine. A fire came through the area in late July, a big one, wind-driven, moving faster than anyone expected. His neighbor's family, a boy named Tommy, who had been my father's closest friend since kindergarten, didn't get out fast enough. The family survived, barely, but Tommy's father had burns on his forearms that never fully healed, and they lost the entire property. Every building, all of it. Tommy's family moved to Phoenix that fall and my father never saw him again. I was 8 years old, my father said. And I stood at the end of our driveway, watching that smoke column come over the ridge, and I thought, this is a thing that takes whatever it wants. There's no reasoning with it. There's no negotiating. He went quiet for a moment. When you started talking about fire, when you were 16 and leaving those books on the kitchen counter, I felt that same thing I felt at the end of the driveway, just terror, all the way down. I stood very still. I didn't know how to say that, so I said other things instead. Stupid things, things that probably sounded like I didn't believe in you. The desert around us was quiet except for the distant soft sound of music drifting from the tent. I believed in you, he said. I just didn't know how to live with what you chose. 30 years of criticism and distance, sitting right there in one explanation. Not cruelty, not indifference. Just a man carrying a childhood terror he'd never given a proper name to, and passing it forward in the only form he could manage. I leaned against the stone wall and breathed for a while, before I trusted myself to speak. You could have told me, Dad. He looked at me directly, which he almost never does. I know I could have. A long pause. That moment tonight, he said. Those people standing up. His voice was rough at the edges. I didn't understand what you did before tonight. I think I understand it now. I made the right call, I said, on that ridge. You made the right call, he said. I know that now. He nodded once. I just needed to say it out loud. To you. That hit me somewhere so old and buried, I didn't have a name for the place. I was in the parking lot of my hotel in the early dark before sunrise. Old habit from seasons of 4 a.m. crew briefings. When I heard gravel crunching behind me. My father was standing beside his rental car in the gray pre-dawn light, holding a manila folder. He looked smaller at that hour, the way people do when there's no audience for their posture. Inside the folder was a stack of printed pages and paper clippings, every article written about the Kaibab fire, the Safety Board executive summary, the Arizona Republic feature, a piece from Wildfire magazine, a printed screenshot of a firefighter forum thread where hotshot crew members had discussed my withdrawal call at length. My father had drawn a yellow highlighter line under one response. That super made the call every one of us trains to make, but almost nobody has the nerve to actually make. She read the terrain, she trusted herself, and she brought her people home. That's the whole job right there. He'd been collecting these since the investigation started. He'd printed things at the library, he said. Didn't want them on the home computer, where he'd have to explain the search history to my mother. She kept your letters, he said. From your first deployment out to the Gila, your first season. I read them again last night. He reached into the folder and pulled out one page, a printout of an email I'd sent home the summer I was 19, my first real fire assignment. I barely remembered writing it. His voice was careful and controlled in the way of a man, holding something he doesn't want to drop. I'd written, I know you're worried. I know you don't understand why I'm here. But Dad, I have never in my whole life felt more like myself than I do standing on this hillside right now. I hope someday that's enough. His eyes were wet when he looked up. It was always enough, he said. I just didn't know how to tell you that. I'm sorry it took me this long. I looked at my father in the early Arizona morning, a man who had spent 20 years being afraid of a thing, and calling that fear criticism, and for the first time in my life I believed him completely. Not because he'd earned it yet, but because I could finally see what was underneath. Lacey found us an hour later, and brought coffee from a gas station down the road. 3 cups and a box of glazed donuts, which was the best breakfast I'd had in recent memory. She hugged me like she meant it and told me not to disappear for 8 months at a stretch anymore. I told her I'd try. She said that was good enough. Driving north toward Flagstaff, the canyon walls catching first light in my rearview mirror, I turned something over that I'd never quite been able to put into words in 30 years of living. The most dangerous thing about wildfire is not the flame, it's the smoke. What it hides, what it obscures, what it makes you miss, that's right in front of you. My father had loved me through 30 years of smoke he'd never learned to clear. My mother kept the evidence in silence. My sister finally said the words she'd been sitting on. And somewhere on a ridge in the Kaibab Plateau 2 summers ago, in the 8 seconds between reading the wind and making the call, I had already stopped needing any of their permission to know exactly who I was. I just hadn't understood that yet. At the edge of town, I stopped at a small diner near the station. A young woman in an NPS volunteer shirt spotted me before I'd even ordered. She went slightly rigid the way new people do when they recognize someone they weren't expecting to see in a diner booth, uncertain whether the protocol situation. Then she straightened, composed herself, and offered an earnest and slightly crooked salute. I returned it without hesitation. For the first time in longer than I can name, the drive back felt lighter than the drive out. Not because anything had been fixed overnight, but because some things had finally been said out loud, in the right canyon, to the right people, at the right hour. That's usually how it goes with fire. The clearing comes after, not before. If this story reached something in you, share it with someone who spent too long waiting to hear. The people who love them were always proud. They just needed to learn how to say it.